Good morning. As we look at the 22, 23, and 24, the chapters of 1 Samuel, we find Saul still in pursuit of David. But the ending of chapter 24, we have a little bit of a turnaround. So, but not to get ahead of ourselves too far, chapter 22 starts with David, having kind of pretended to be a madman at this area, leaving and going off to a place that says a cave of Adullam, where his brothers and his father's house heard of where he was and came to him. And it says, everyone who was in distress, who was in debt, who was discontented, gathered to him, and he became the captain of them. And there were about 400 men that way. So while Saul is seeking David, others are able to find David. And it's a sign, it's a way of seeing for us that God is protecting David and leading David in all of these things. So then David went, he left from there, and he goes to the king of Moab, and he asks, can my father and my mother, can we live here? And some of his family members, and the king of Moab agrees with that. And so we have these other surrounding countries that, David seeks out help from a neighboring country, neighboring people. And then the prophet Gad said to Daniel, don't remain here, but you better go to the land of Judah. So David again flees. And Saul hears of where David is. And he gets word while he's sitting under this tree, this particular place. They name it by the town and this certain tree. And then he says, hear now, you Benjamites, who the son of Jesse gave it. Will the son of Jesse give you this? So he's saying this David, this son of Jesse, can't even bring himself to say David's name. But will he provide for you? Will he give you all of the things that I do? Well, what kind of king will he be? What's he got? And he's putting David down to these people, speaking against him. And again, here now we have this name of Doeg, D-O-E-G, the Edomite, who was in charge of servants. So he speaks up to Saul and he says, I saw this. How does he say it? I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Abimelech, the son, to the priests. And so Saul then sends for these priests, and the priests come, and they have indeed taken care of David. They provided food for David. Remember the loaves of the sacred holy bread, or the bread that was set aside for God that they had given to David and his men. But this Doeg, he tells the king, this is where he is. So the king, again, then, as I said, calls for the priests to come. And he comes and he says, here I am. And it says, why have you conspired against me? Why have you worked with this upstart David? Why, you and this son of Jesse, again, can't say David, son of Jesse, by giving him bread and a sword, And the priest speaks up in favor of David. He says, who among your people is as faithful to you as David? Who has done as much good for you and for the Israelites as David? And, Saul doesn't want to have anybody praising David. He gets upset and he tells his men, the guard that are with him, to kill these priests, and they refuse. But this Doeg, the Edomite, I'll do it. And he kills, it says, 85 priests. And what a horrible thing to do. You think about that. These priests are serving God, serving Saul, serving the people. And Saul, in his madness, can't understand those things. He doesn't see that. And not only does he have this Doeg kill a priest, but men and women and children and animals in this city. He just... and it's just a terrible slaughter. And when David hears of that slaughter, later when we get down into, after verse 20 rather here, one of the people had escaped, the sword. He had run away first, or he was hiding or whatever, but he got away and he went and he told David what had happened. And David says, the death of all of these people is on me. I am responsible for that, you know, and you know, rather than blame Saul, rather than blame Saul's madness, David says, since I was there and since they helped me, you know, they have died because of me. You know, he takes responsibility for that. And you know, it's one of those things, I mean, so many people try to hide from responsibility or shirk the responsibility or at least share the blame, you know, and rather than David taking the blame, he could have just, you know, put it all on Saul, but he didn't. He understood that these people died because of him. You know, and what a sad, sad thing. And now after all of this, David hears about the Philistines attacking a city. And David inquires of God, should I go? Should I take my men? And God says, yes, take your men and you will be victorious. He talks to his men and they're not so sure. I mean, there was about 400 of them. It doesn't tell us he's gotten any more. But so again, a second time, David inquires of God. You know, he speaks to him in prayer or whatever, but God answers. And God says, yes, go. You will be successful against them. You will drive them out. So David and his band of men go, and they're fighting for Saul. They're fighting for all of Israel. They're fighting for the people. And, you know, he has a good victory. And again, does Saul rejoice in that? No. Saul is still jealous and angered by these different things, and then David went to another city after this battle, and it was a city that was walled and gated so that, you know, it could protect itself. And Saul figured, well, we're going to take our men and we're going to go and we'll catch David there, and you know, we're going to set the city. We're going to besiege the city. But again, David found out and fled before Saul got there. And again, Saul was upset with this city, you know. But as they were coming, as David found out about this, you know, he again inquired of God, will the men of this city protect me, or will they turn me over to Saul? And God's reply to him was, they will turn you over to Saul. So David took that advice and he fled. And he was out in the wilderness, and you know, and people would hear kind of where David was, and they'd tell Saul, and by the time Saul got there, David would have moved on until we get to the beginning of chapter 24, and there was one place where that David's on one side of the mountain and Saul's on the other side of the mountain, and they're going back and forth, but all of a sudden, you know, they come to this place and Saul needs to relieve himself. He needs to go to the bathroom. And so he goes into a cave, and maybe you're familiar with this story. I think it's kind of cute, but, you know, Saul goes in and he's, you know, squatting there doing his job, and David is in that same cave hiding, he and his men. And David comes up behind him and cuts a part of his robe off with his sword while Saul is busy, and Saul doesn't even know it. Saul finishes and leaves, goes out, and then as he's outside there somewhere, David comes out and he says, my Lord Saul, my king. And Saul hears and turns around. And David holds up this piece of the robe that he had cut off of Saul's robe. And Saul realizes, he says, David, you are more faithful. You are more upright. You are more honest. And Saul finally gets some sanity, maybe we should say. But he realizes that how good David is and how much David is going to serve him and protect him and do his will. And so, I mean, Saul, you know, basically weeps, you know. And, you know, David, in this deal, David says, see, my father, David calls Saul father, the king. See the corner of your cloak in my hand? You know, I just cut off the corner of your cloak. I didn't kill you. You know, and he says, for this you can know there's no treason in my hand. He said, you know, and even though David has already been anointed as king by Samuel, Saul is still the acting king. I mean, he hasn't been disposed, and David didn't go in to kill him or anything like that, but finally Saul comes to his senses and welcomes David back into his kingdom, into his service and all of that. And then he says, you know, I know, you know, toward the end of chapter 24, I know now that you will be king. and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. This is Saul. Now swear to me that you will not cut off my descendants from me. Because this is one of the things, when someone else would take over, a new king would come, or, in the battle, one king defeats another. What do? They kill all of that king's family. So there is no royal blood seeking the seat of his father or his grandfather. David says, I won't do that. And and we're going to find out that David is true to those words. And so as we end with, so David swore this to Saul, and then Saul went home, and David made his home at the stronghold. But David has been fleeing Saul, and Saul has been out of his mind. But here now, I think, with the realization that there is no treason in David, that David serves faithfully, I think, and I just hope, for Saul's sake, that he has some peace in his mind. And he's been so focused on doing David in, that I wonder what kind of king was he to the rest of the community. I mean, not a great one. We saw that in the killing of all of the priests and everything. But Saul is shown by David's faithfulness, and by God leading David, that David is an honorable and upright man. And I think about that as David becomes king in the upcoming chapters and serves, how his men have been able to perceive and see David in all of his faithfulness to the kingdom of Israel and to God.